And thank you all for coming. I'm John Garvey. I'm the Dean of the Law School, and my job is the 3-minute job of introducing the speaker, which I will do momentarily. But first I want to make 2 announcements. The first is that at the conclusion of Mr. Weigel's lecture, there will be a period for some question and answer, and you're asked to hold your question. We have 2 students, Adam and Rachel, with Rachel? Or Grace, Rachel, with microphones who will bring them around to you. So if you'll hold your question until the microphone gets to you, we can record it for posterity, and that would be nice. The second announcement is that at the conclusion of the question and answer period, Mr. Weigel will be meeting with some students in the 5th floor lounge of this building. So, but let me say a word or 2 about Mr. Weigel, and then he can start. Mr. Weigel, George Weigel, is one of America's most prominent Catholic intellectuals. He's a member of the editorial boards of First Things and Crisis. He serves as a consultant on Vatican affairs for NBC. And for nearly a decade, he was president of an organization called the Ethics and Public Policy Center in Washington, D.C. He's now a senior fellow there. And he's the John M. Olin Chair in Religion and American Democracy. In that role, he published in 1999 a biography of Pope John Paul II entitled Witness to Hope. The book has been published in at least 10 languages by now and has won immense critical acclaim. Mr. Weigel's the author or editor of 15 other books, including Catholicism and the Renewal of American Democracy, about a dozen years ago, a book called The Final Revolution, Soul of the World, and most relevant to tonight's talk, a book called The Courage to be Catholic, which was published by Basic Books in the course of this year. Robert Coles, who's a Pulitzer Prize-winning child psychologist and a favorite author of mine, wrote a book 10 years ago called Harvard Diary. And in it he's a shrink, and in it he complains about the modern tendency to transform religion into something else, to make the sacrament of reconciliation, for example, an exercise in counseling psychology. He says that's a poor trade, and it misses the point of the sacrament because God deals in grace and Freud does not. Well, George Weigel's The Courage to be Catholic is sort of like Coles's book. There's a lot of explanations for the clergy sex abuse crisis, and they may all be true. Many of them, as you might expect, are psychological, that celibacy is an unnatural state and breaks out in acts like these, or that an all-male priesthood has a different mental makeup than a male and female priesthood would, or that seminaries don't do enough psychological screening, and so on. I'm a lawyer, and I'm familiar with legal explanations for this sort of thing, that we need the Attorney General or Governor Keating and some representative committee to watch over the discipline of priests, or that we need stricter punishments for offending bishops and more liberal discovery rules, and so on. Well, all of these may be true, but I don't know that there is sufficient explanation or solution to what's going on. Mr. Weigel maintains in his book that the problem that we're dealing with is a crisis of fidelity, that it is a crisis of faith, that there are religious causes and, we hope, religious cures for the problem that we're facing. Let me introduce Mr. Weigel, and he can tell you his answers to all these. Mr. Weigel.
Thank you very much, Professor Garvey. Thank you to all of you for being here. This is a wonderful turnout, and I hope no one's back suffers in consequence of the seating arrangements here. And thank you for inviting me to join in your reflections, this important set of reflections here at Boston College on the future of the Catholic Church in the United States in this new century. In this 12th month of the long Lent of 2002, it is reasonable to ask ourselves a question of proportion. Are we, in fact, living through the most serious crisis in the history of the Church in the United States? What about the lay trusteeship battles of the pre-Civil War period, the struggle to assimilate immigrant communities, the Civil War itself, in which Catholicism was the only American denomination not to divide into northern and southern branches? What about the attacks of the pre-Civil War know-nothings and the anti-Catholic bigots of the late 19th century? These were all genuine crises. But the long Lent of 2002, which continues today and is likely to continue for some time, is an even more serious crisis, I suggest. Struggles about the control of church property have gone on for centuries. Anti-Catholic bigotry is another staple on the historical scene. This crisis is different. It is different because it is self-generated, rather than being caused by the Church's external critics or enemies. It is different because it is the product of another deeper crisis, a spiritual crisis, a crisis of fidelity. It is different because it touches truths that are the very constitution of the Church, as that constitution was given us by Christ the Lord himself. This crisis is different because unless its causes are clearly understood and systematically addressed, the Church will not be able to realize the tremendous potential of the Second Vatican Council and become the great evangelical movement for the 21st century that Blessed John the 23rd envisioned. This is different because this crisis has become a major obstacle to the Church's public witness at precisely the moment when the Church's teaching about the dignity of the human person is so desperately needed in our society and culture. In order to measure the crisis accurately, however, we have to remind ourselves what a crisis is through the prism of Christian faith. In the thought world of the Bible, the word crisis has two meanings. A crisis is a cataclysmic upheaval, the familiar sense of the term in ordinary English usage. But the biblical world also thinks of crisis as opportunity, a moment ripe with the potential for deeper conversion. The cataclysmic aspect of the Catholic crisis of 2002 is all too familiar to all of us. A scandal of clerical sexual misbehavior was transformed into a genuine crisis by a parallel failure of leadership by the bishops of the Church. But what about the opportunity? The opportunity embedded in this crisis, I suggest, is to complete the reform of the Church according to the teaching of the Second Vatican Council, as authoritatively interpreted by the teaching of Pope John Paul II. The opportunity, in other words, is for a genuinely Catholic reform of the Church. Not the transformation of Catholicism into another American denomination, but the authentic reform of Catholic belief and practice, so that the Church becomes what it must be in 21st century America. A vibrant evangelical movement that proclaims the gospel of Jesus Christ in and out of season, and in doing so helps rebuild the foundations of a culture of life capable of sustaining the great American experiment in democratic self-governance. At other moments of crisis in Catholic history, cataclysm became opportunity when the Church became more intentionally, thoroughly, indeed radically Catholic. At other moments of crisis in Catholic history, crisis became opportunity when the Church declined to succumb to the spirit of the age, but reached back to its roots, to those truths which Christ left the Church as its essential foundation in order to give birth to a new springtime of the Catholic spirit. And that, I suggest, is what we are called to do today. To build, with the help of God's grace, a more deeply Catholic Church. Not Catholic light, but a thoroughly Catholic Catholicism in which the adventure of orthodoxy, the adventure of fidelity, is recognized for what it truly is, namely the greatest of all human adventures. Let me sketch briefly, then, my understanding of what the crisis is, what the crisis is not, how the crisis happened, and what might be done to achieve a genuinely Catholic reform of the Church in America. First, then, what the crisis is. The crisis is, first of all, a crisis of priestly identity. The scandal of clergy sexual abuse has many dimensions: psychological, legal, even political. But viewed from inside, as Catholics should view it, that is, viewed theologically, the scandal of clerical sexual abuse and misbehavior is rooted in a crisis of priestly identity. Put most simply, a priest who truly believes himself to be what the Catholic Church teaches he is, namely an icon, a living representation of the eternal priesthood of Jesus Christ, simply does not behave as a sexual predator. With children, with young men and teenagers, which seems to be the most prevalent form of contemporary clergy sexual abuse, or with women. The crisis of priestly identity that followed the Second Vatican Council, a crisis whose full dimensions we have no time to explore here tonight, seems to have led to a crisis of priestly discipline, including sexual self-discipline. And that disciplinary crisis is at bottom a theological crisis, a crisis in who the Church's priests understand themselves to be. In the second place, the crisis is one of episcopal leadership. While no one knows with any certainty the extent of clergy sexual abuse, what studies we do have suggest that clerical sexual abusers are something like 1.6 to 2% of all priests, a figure lower than the national average for adult sexual abusers. So why did the revelation of sexual abuse by priests over the past several decades create such a firestorm of anger, not simply among the Church's traditional enemies and critics, who of course wasted little time getting into the fray, but among Catholics themselves? There were several reasons for this anger, it seems to me, an anger which continues today. Catholics were and are angry because Catholics esteem the priesthood and deeply resent its corruption. Catholics were and are angry because many cases of clerical sexual predation involve the sexual abuse of minors. Catholics were and are angry because the most prominent and loathsome of these cases involve the sexual abuse of children. But it is instructive to note that the deepest angers of Catholics these past 12 months have been reserved for bishops. Bishops who seem to have done little or nothing to address the problem of sexual scandal. Bishops whose primary efforts seem directed at keeping the scandals out of the public eye. Bishops who seemingly did little to reach out to victims. Catholics intuitively understand that strong episcopal leadership is essential in the Church. And Catholics intuitively understand that given bold, even given adequate episcopal leadership willing to face facts and undertake genuine reforms, a pattern of clerical sexual scandal need not have turned into the greatest crisis in U.S. Catholic history. It became that because of a failure to lead. And that failure was itself the product of a crisis of episcopal identity. The failures of episcopal leadership that turned a significant and urgent problem of clerical sexual abuse into a full-blown crisis touched all three of the bishop's classic roles, that is, as men who are to teach, govern, and sanctify. Too many bishops have manifestly failed to remind their priests and teach their people of some essential truths about the Catholic priesthood and the relationship of that priesthood to celibate chastity. Too many bishops have failed to ensure that those truths were effectively taught in seminaries. Too many bishops have failed to move swiftly and decisively to see that clerical sexual predators are no longer a danger to the Church. Too many bishops have failed to act as pastors to the victims of sexual abuse and as agents of repentance and reconciliation in their local churches. Too many bishops, in a word, have reacted to the multiple problems posed by the meltdown of priestly discipline and the subsequent outbreak of clerical sexual abuse as managers, not as apostles. That, I suggest, is one of the primary reasons why Catholics in the United States have lived virtually all of 2002 in sorrow and in anger. Understandable, and if you will permit the term, righteous anger. That is why a serious problem became a crisis. As the Holy Father said to the U.S. Cardinals at their meeting in Rome in April, the root of this crisis lies in a failure to teach and live the fullness of Catholic faith. And the primary responsibility for that failure rests with those who are ordained to headship in the Church. In the third place, which is actually the deepest place, the Catholic crisis of 2002 is a crisis of discipleship. Every crisis in Catholic history is a crisis caused by an insufficiency of saints, by a deficit in sanctity. And because sanctity is every Catholic's baptismal vocation, this dimension of the crisis touches all of us in the community of the baptized. And that is why all of us have a responsibility for helping turn crisis as cataclysm into crisis as opportunity. We exercise that responsibility in different ways, and genuinely Catholic reform means recognizing that. Genuinely Catholic reform does not involve lay Catholics becoming pseudo-clerics or ordained Catholics becoming laicized in their understanding of what it means to be a priest or bishop. But at the bottom of the bottom line, crisis will become opportunity if all the people of the Church make this crisis the occasion to live more thoroughly, intentionally, radically Christian lives of discipleship, staking all on the Lord. The famous gospel scene of Peter and Jesus on the Sea of Galilee is helpful here. When Peter keeps his eyes fixed on the Lord, he can do what seems impossible. He can walk on water. When he averts his gaze from Christ, when he begins looking around elsewhere for security, he sinks. We too can do the impossible if we keep our gaze fixed on Christ. When we look elsewhere, we sink. And that is as true of the Church as it is of individual Christians. And a church flailing about in the whitewater of late modernity is not the renewed and reformed church that John the 23rd called for in his epic opening address to the Second Vatican Council 40 years ago this past October. Secondly, what the crisis is not. In order to advance the cause of authentically Catholic reform, it is just as important to understand what the crisis is not as to understand what it is. This is not a crisis of celibacy, nor is it a crisis caused by celibacy. At the most elementary level, and in its scandal dimension, the crisis was caused by men manifestly not living the celibate commitment they had promised to Christ and to the Church. To blame the crisis on celibacy makes about as much sense as blaming treason on the Pledge of Allegiance. When a man commits treason, we don't say there must be something wrong with the Pledge of Allegiance. We say the man has committed treason. We describe treason for what it is, which is the only way to deal with treason's effects. It is similarly spurious to suggest that this crisis wouldn't have happened if the Church had a married clergy in its Latin rite. In the first place, denominations with married clergy have their own serious problems of clerical sexual misconduct and abuse, and some of the fragmentary data we have suggests that these problems are at least as bad in those denominations as in the Catholic Church. But at a deeper theological level, to suggest that marriage would prevent abusive or predatory behavior is to deny that marriage is a covenant of mutual love, receptivity, and fruitfulness. To suggest that marriage would prevent sexual predation is to turn marriage into a crime prevention program, which is not the proper biblical and Catholic understanding of marriage. In the second place, this is not a crisis caused by the Church's alleged authoritarianism. To begin with, and as we have seen, a scandal of sexual misconduct was turned into a crisis precisely because of failures to exercise genuine authority by the ordained heads of local churches. Beyond that, the charge makes no sense because the Catholic Church is not an authoritarian institution. Rather, the Church is a communion of disciples formed by an authoritative tradition and accountable to that authoritative tradition. In the third place, I suggest that descriptions of this as a pedophilia crisis are misplaced. That tag got applied to the crisis because of the Gagin case here in Boston, which did involve classic pedophilia, that is, the sexual abuse of prepubescent children. Still, the fragmentary empirical evidence available from the cases that have been brought to public attention in the past year suggest that this disgusting form of sexual predation is not the most prevalent form of clerical sexual abuse, which seems to involve the homosexual abuse of teenagers and young men by priests. In the fourth place, this is not a crisis caused by the media, as some Catholics here and around the world have charged. There have been, and there continue to be, distortions and exaggerations in the press, creating the impression that the sexual abuse of the young was a major, ongoing, and widespread fact of life in Catholicism in the United States was a disservice to the truth. And yes, other agendas have certainly been at work in press coverage and commentary on the Catholic crisis of 2002. Can anyone seriously doubt that those journalists and commentators who see the Catholic Church as the last institutional barrier to completing the revolution of lifestyle libertinism in the United States have, as Mr. Dooley would have put it, seen their opportunities and took them? Still, this is the Church's crisis, not the media's crisis. And there is a case to be made that the Church owes at least some elements of the media a debt of gratitude for forcing to the surface issues that many church leaders themselves seemed reluctant to deal with. In the fifth place, this is not a crisis caused by the Church's sexual ethic. As with celibacy, the empirical case is clear. In its scandal dimension, this is a crisis caused by a catastrophic failure to live the truth of the Church's sexual ethic. And that failure, in turn, was influenced by a failure to understand and celebrate the Church's sexual ethic, which lifts up and ennobles the gift of sexual love within the bond of faithful and fruitful marriage. The truth of the matter, brilliantly displayed in Pope John Paul II's Theology of the Body, is that the Catholic Church has a higher, more deeply humanistic view of human sexuality than the worlds represented by Playboy and Cosmopolitan, worlds in which sex has been reduced and traduced into simply another contact sport. And if we take history seriously, can we doubt that the toxic effects of the sexual revolution have themselves played a role in the crisis of clerical sexual misconduct? Permit me to suggest, then, that Catholic universities and colleges, where the Catholic sexual ethic is treated intellectually as a curious medieval artifact, and where the Church's sexual ethic has no discernible place in the ordering of college life, are not Catholic universities and colleges, where we can expect adequate analyses of the Catholic crisis of 2002 or adequate prescriptions for genuinely Catholic reform in the 21st century to come. How the crisis happened. The causalities involved in the Catholic crisis of 2002 are obviously complex, involving both institutional and personal factors. Let me suggest, though, that the best way to understand why this happened when it did and how it did is to understand it in terms drawn from environmentalism. To understand this as an ecological crisis, a crisis caused by a deeply damaged Catholic ecology that, like all damaged ecologies, eventually produced mutations and diseases. The damaged ecology of the Church itself has multiple causes, but we can begin to get a grip on at least part of the problem by recognizing that a culture of dissent in the Church, which broke out in earnest in the wake of the 1968 encyclical Humanae Vitae, led to a kind of invisible schism, an invisible rupture in Catholic life, a rupture that was to have profound behavioral consequences. Let me be quite clear and specific about what I mean here. By culture of dissent, I do not mean that normal and healthy questioning and probing of the truths of faith that is the lifeblood of theology. Nor do I mean the struggle all of us experience to be faithful disciples, a struggle that is part of the ongoing dynamics of the Christian life. Rather, by culture of dissent, I mean the claim, advanced by some theologians, some priests, some religious, and some bishops, that in certain matters, such as the morally appropriate means to plan one's family and regulate fertility, the Church's supreme teaching authority was in fact teaching falsely and leading the people of the Church into error. It is one thing to say of a matter of doctrine or moral teaching, I don't understand. Perhaps the teaching authority of the Church can make this clearer. Perhaps we need to think about this truth in a more refined way. Perhaps the pastoral implications of this truth need to be more carefully explored. It is something else entirely to say the teaching authority is teaching falsehoods and leading the Church into error. To say that is to make more than an intellectual judgment. To say that is to declare oneself out of full communion with the Church, to put oneself into invisible schism. And that, as we have come to see, has all sorts of consequences. In many American faculties of theology and seminaries after the Humanae Vitae controversy, and then again after the 1994 apostolic letter Ordinatio Sacerdotalis, men learned to lead lives of intellectual and spiritual self-deception. As most bishops were not prepared to ordain men who were public dissidents, candidates for the priesthood and the bishops who ordained them learned to lead a form of double life, overtly accepting teachings on conjugal morality, on sexual morality in general, on the possible ordination of women to the ministerial priesthood, that they did not in fact accept and had no intention of teaching, defending, or promoting in pastoral life. This self-deception has had enormous consequences. Bishops, unwilling to enforce theological discipline, came to think of themselves as discussion group moderators, whose primary task was to keep everyone in play and reasonably happy. And we have seen the results of that. Some priests' consciences became deadened, as intellectual self-deception helped prepare the ground for behavioral self-deception. And we have seen the results of that. Lay Catholics, and indeed some priests and bishops, came to think of Catholic truth as a kind of smorgasbord from which one could pick and choose as tastes dictated. The net result of all this was that the ecology of the Church was damaged severely, as Catholic light displaced classic Catholicism, and the Church got uncomfortably comfortable, or so we thought, living with the reality of invisible schism, of fractured communion. That is not all that happened in the years after the Second Vatican Council to create the current crisis of clerical sexual abuse and episcopal leadership in the Catholic Church in the United States. Clerical predators and malfeasant bishops are men who make choices for which they, not the times, are responsible. Certain aspects of clerical culture, within the presbyterate, within the episcopate, in relations between priests and bishops, and in relations between bishops and Rome, played important roles in the breakdown of clerical discipline and the failure of episcopal governance. All of that can be fully granted. And yet, if, thinking theologically, we take Vatican II's turn to history seriously, it must become clear that the culture of dissent is a large part of what happened. Historically knowledgeable and realistic people can understand that clerical sexual corruption has been and always will be a problem in the Church. But there is no explaining the breadth of the corruption that was brought to public attention in the first half of 2002, or the lack of effective governance from some bishops in responding to it, without taking full account of the invisible schism that the culture of dissent created in the Catholic Church in the United States. To be sure, that schism first took place privately, inside the minds and souls of many clergy and some bishops. What has now been made unmistakably clear are the schism's grave institutional effects. Ideas have consequences. Dissent is a matter of ideas. Dissent and institutional acquiescence to dissent have had terrible consequences for the people of the Church and for the Church's public reputation. So, what is to be done? In my book, The Courage to be Catholic, I lay out a comprehensive agenda for reform involving seminary recruitment, seminary formation and theological education, priestly lifestyle and continuing education, and the selection and disciplining of bishops. Here, let me focus on 2 points. The first is seminary reform. Some of this has begun in the past 15 years and with good results. That reform process must now be completed. And the first step in that process is to reform recruitment procedures so that the first questions asked about a man's possible candidacy for the priesthood have to do with the quality of his discipleship, not with his scores on the Myers-Briggs personality profile. Is this man a converted Christian disciple who has given his life to Jesus Christ? Has he manifested a capacity to deepen others' relationship to Christ or to introduce others to the Lord? Those are surely the first things we want to know about potential candidates for the priesthood. And getting those questions back into first place means confronting the degree to which vocation work in the United States has become dominated by psychological and therapeutic rather than theological and biblical categories in the past several decades. I am not suggesting that personality screens and psychological testing are not important parts of the recruitment process. I am suggesting that when the basic questions of effective discipleship are not put first, a skewed evaluation process results. Similar reform is needed in the process of forming men to lead chaste celibate lives in seminaries. In recent decades, education for chastity has tended in many seminaries to be dominated by the seminary psychologist or by psychiatrists. This must end. The insights of psychologists and psychiatrists are helpful and important, but it is wholly chaste priests who will best form other men for lives of chaste celibate witness in the church and the world. And that formation must be intellectual and spiritual. It cannot be considered a matter of psychological maturity alone. Indeed, throughout the formation process in seminaries, theology must once again take precedence over psychology as the crucial intellectual framework of seminary formators. Then there is the question of the reform of theological education in the seminaries of the 21st century. Seminarians formed in an intellectual climate in which it is simply assumed that modern thought is superior to all previous forms of thought will not think of Augustine, Aquinas, and Bonaventure, Catherine of Siena, and Teresa of Avila as men and women they ought to continue to get to know during their ministry. Seminarians to whom it has been suggested, subtly or overtly, that tradition is a synonym for obfuscation will never get a sense of the Church's tradition as a living, developing thing, a conversation across centuries and cultures, and they will not be able to present it as such to their people when they are priests. Thus, intellectually ill-formed priests contribute, overtly or inadvertently, to the notion that every issue in the Catholic Church is really an issue of power, when in fact the serious issues being contested in the Church are all issues of truth. These confusions must be remedied if the future priests of the United States are to speak intelligently to one of the most well-educated Catholic populations in the Church's history. The remedies include seminaries securing faculty members who are unimpeachably orthodox, who understand the distinctive nature of theological education in a seminary, and who themselves lead lives of holiness as priests, religious, or lay Catholics. It is not a matter of theological or intellectual repression, but of common sense, to insist that every member of a seminary's teaching and formation faculties accepts and is prepared to defend the most bitterly contested teachings of the Catholic Church today, including the Church's teaching on sexual morality. Men and women who do not accept these teachings cannot adequately explain them to seminarians who are expected to accept them and then to teach them as priests. To repeat, insisting on orthodoxy among seminary faculty should be understood less as a disciplinary issue than as a matter of Catholic intellectual integrity. Much of the culture of dissent has seemed to have forgotten the Catholic sacramental imagination, whose recovery is so crucial to the reform of Catholic life across the board. It makes no sense whatsoever to nourish that forgetting in seminaries. Theology, rightly understood, is not religious studies. It does not take a neutral stance toward the Catholic tradition. By the standards of the discipline, the religious and moral convictions of a professor of religious studies are of no greater consequence to his or her work than the religious and moral convictions of a chemist are to the study of inorganic compounds. Theology is different. Because theology is a disciplined intellectual effort to understand divine revelation, theology starts with revelation as contained in Scripture and tradition and is accountable to revelation. Thus, the convictions of a theologian are intrinsic to his or her craft, and this must be taken into account when hiring seminary faculty members. To assert this is not a matter of violating academic freedom, nor is it a matter of banning speculative theology from seminaries. Seminarians must understand that theology is a developing science. But all such speculation must take place within a determined conviction to think with the Church, and within a clear understanding that the rule of faith, the regula fidei, is determined by the Church's pastors, not by the Church's theologians. The second area of reform that I would highlight tonight has to do with the reform of the episcopate. There has been considerable discussion this past year about the process by which bishops are selected for the Latin Rite Catholic Church in the United States, and I have several suggestions for refining that process in The Courage to be Catholic. But here, let me focus on what I consider the more urgent question, which is the question of criteria. For the mechanics of the process are of less immediate consequence for deep and authentic Catholic reform than are the criteria that guide the nomination of bishops. The current criteria are obvious from the form letter that the nuncio, the Vatican's representative in the United States, sends to those asked to comment on a prospective candidate, in which questions are asked about a priest's character, his fidelity to the Church's teaching, his spiritual life, his habits, and so forth. All of this is unexceptionable, but it is also insufficient. The criteria must be expanded and sharpened so that the selection process takes better account of the cultural climate faced by any man who would teach, govern, and sanctify as a Catholic bishop in the United States in the 21st century. That climate is saturated with fears about being considered intolerant or insensitive, labels readily attached to anyone asserting moral truths that cut across the grain of freedom misunderstood as license. Moreover, ours is a culture deeply influenced by bureaucratic models of governance, which affect everything from the local scout troop and parish council to General Motors, the United Auto Workers, and the Pentagon. It is, in sum, an atmosphere in which it is very easy for a bishop to think of himself as a mitred referee, an Episcopal discussion group moderator whose primary responsibility is to keep the dialogue going and everyone within it reasonably content. This is not a model of episcopacy that would have made sense to Ambrose or Augustine, Athanasius or John Chrysostom, Francis de Sales or Charles Borromeo. It is also a model of episcopacy that is wholly inadequate to the deep reform of the Catholic Church according to the mind of the Second Vatican Council. That reform is going to require more bishops of vision, determination, and grit, willing to challenge the flexity of our culture and the effects of that softness on the life of the Church, which have been made all too painfully evident in the crisis of 2002. The object of the selection process, in other words, is to find apostles, men with the convictions necessary to undergird their own courage to be Catholic and the evangelical fire to inspire that courage in others. With that goal in mind, the following should be added to the standard list of questions asked of knowledgeable people about a prospective candidate for the office of bishop. In his life and ministry, does this priest manifest a personal conversion to Jesus Christ and a deliberate choice to abandon everything to follow Christ? Does this priest teach the gospel with conviction and clarity? Can he make the Church's proposal to those who do not believe? With charity, can he instruct and, if necessary, admonish Catholics who have embraced teachings contrary to the gospel and the teaching authority of the Church? Has this priest ever been a pastor? Did the parish grow under his leadership? If his primary work has been as a professor in a seminary, did his students flourish under his tutelage? How does this priest celebrate Mass in concrete and specific terms? Does his liturgical ministry lead his people into a deeper experience of the Paschal mystery of Jesus Christ, crucified and risen? How many men have entered the seminary because of this priest's influence? How many women have entered consecrated religious life because of his influence? Does he encourage lay movements of Catholic renewal, and does he encourage the development of popular piety? In sum, is he a man who can call others to holiness because he manifests holiness in his own life? Does this priest have the strength of character and personality to make decisions that will be unpopular with other priests and religious because those decisions are faithful to the Church's teaching and liturgical practice? Is this priest well-read theologically? Does he regard theology as an important part of his vocation? Can he translate the best of the Church's theology, ancient and contemporary, into an idiom accessible to his people? Answers to these questions will help the responsible authorities of the Church determine whether a candidate is a man of conviction and courage. Acknowledging that these are among the important questions to ask will demonstrate that the responsible authorities of the Church recognize the kinds of demands placed on a man who is a 21st century Catholic bishop in the United States. A man who must have the courage to be countercultural, but in ways that call the Church and the culture to conversion. The task is not to find men who will lead us into the catacombs. The task is to find men who will be apostles, leading the Church toward a springtime of evangelization. Beyond these questions of criteria for the selection of bishops, I suggest that the past year has made clear as well the necessity of critically evaluating the structure and function of the Bishops' National Conference, which was unable to deal with the scandal of sexual abuse effectively in the 1990s, and whose actions this past year have not been without some serious problems. Is the conference as presently constituted and as it presently functions an aid or a hindrance to effective episcopal headship in the diocese? Does the conference's bureaucratic structure impede the kind of sharp-edged analysis of the Catholic crisis of 2002 that is essential? The norms passed at the bishops' meeting in Washington last month, norms which should have been adopted a decade ago, have given the bishops the instruments to deal with the most noxious weeds in the Catholic garden. What is to be done now to revitalize the soil of the garden so that it is less likely to produce noxious weeds in the future? And is the present conference structure and process capable of addressing that question? I doubt it, and so I think do perhaps one-third of the bishops of the United States. In the mid-1930s, as totalitarian shadows lengthened across Europe, Pope Pius XI memorably said, "Let us thank God that he makes us live among the present problems. It is no longer permitted to anyone to be mediocre." That saying, which was a favorite of Dorothy Day, might also be our watchword in the months and years ahead. Catholic light is Catholic mediocrity. Rediscovering and embracing the adventure of orthodoxy, the high adventure of Christian fidelity, which is the greatest of human adventures, is the path from crisis to authentically Catholic reform. We all fail, sometimes grievously. That is no reason to lower the bar of expectation. We seek forgiveness and reconciliation, and we try again. Lowering the bar of spiritual and moral expectation demeans the faith and demeans us. Catholics today are capable of spiritual and moral grandeur, and indeed want to be called to that greatness. That is what Vatican II meant by the universal call to holiness, and that is what is available to all of us in the Church, whatever missteps the institution of the Church makes. Sanctity is available, and sanctity is what will transform crisis as cataclysm into crisis as opportunity. In that universal call to holiness, and in the generous response to it that can be, and I believe will be, forthcoming, lies the future of authentically, genuinely Catholic reform. So once again, let us thank God that he makes us live among the present problems. It is no longer permitted to anyone to be mediocre. Thank you.
I think we have time for 20 minutes of questions here, and then I wonder, there are books on sale in the library. I wonder, in the lobby, rather. I wonder if Mr. Weigel would be willing to sign them. But let me turn it over to you to take the questions. And please, again, wait for the microphone to arrive at your station.
Thanks. Is it on? I haven't got a chance to read your book, and I apologize if this was in your book. I'm interested in...
remedy that deficiency later.
Absolutely, right. Checkbooks
Take
out.
care of your Christmas shopping.
One for every stocking. I'm interested in, particularly in Boston here, your thoughts on not bishop reform, but bishop accountability. We've talked about priests making choices, and they get defrocked after a certain line. What's your view on the bishops? Is there a line for the bishops? Is it? Should we expect to ever see a bishop be disciplined? Should they be disciplined? Is it? How do you think about that problem?
I try to think about it historically, theologically, and practically. 200 years ago, just after the initial afterburn of the French Revolution, late days of Pope Pius VII, the Holy See, there were then some approximately 700 dioceses in the world. The Church had the freedom to appoint approximately 80 of those bishops. The other 600 and some were appointed by the state, or by the state in consultation with a local cathedral chapter or some other canonical body. For 200 years, the Church has worked very carefully, very systematically, very savvily to disentangle the appointment of its leadership from the embrace of extra ecclesiastical bodies. And in fact, today, the Church is freer to nominate its episcopal leadership than at virtually any time in the last 15 or 1600 years. That accomplishment cannot be mortgaged to plebiscites, media campaigns, polling data, etc. That's the historical moment. Theologically, it seems to me clear that the appropriate bodies for the disciplining of the episcopate are the bishops themselves and, in extremis, the Holy See. If you look at the history of the early church, read the fathers of the church, bishops are correcting and fraternally challenging each other on a regular basis. This is part of the great literature of the first 8 centuries of the Christian movement. Somehow, one of the unhappy effects of the bureaucratization, this intense bureaucratization of Catholic life over the past 35 years, is that this pattern of fraternal challenge and correction has dramatically broken down. It is certainly broken down among bishops. It has broken down to a lesser extent, although to a serious extent, among priests, where it also must be revived. So the first court of redress for these problems, I think, has to be the Episcopal College itself, either in its provincial form, its national form, or ultimately its international universal form. In the Courage to be Catholic, I say that the Church's highest authorities must more directly address the question, what are the criteria by which we will be able to make the reasonable judgment that a man wherever, Pango, Hong Kong, Mombasa, Calgary, Mexico City, wherever, has lost the capacity for governance, What are the criteria that will allow us to make that judgment and to make the appropriate alteration at that point? But I think we have to keep all of these factors involved. When Governor Keating said quite inappropriately this summer that his group would be keeping a scorecard and determining this lay panel who is kosher and who isn't, I had to say, and others had to say, I'm sorry, this is not the Presbyterian Church. This is the Catholic Church. And in the Catholic Church, that's not the way we deal with these kinds of problems. But that there are problems, and that they have to be addressed in a careful, theologically careful way that protects the achievement of the Church for the past 200 years in achieving this really unique period of freedom to order our, to have the freedom to order your own internal life means you take the responsibility to do it well. So you can't blame it on the king anymore. Okay? So I think those are some thoughts I would have on that. Yeah, let's, this gentleman here, get a mic and then we'll get, maybe a few, would you like to come over to this side and that'll encourage the left wing here to get
Yes. Dr. Weigel, the latest issue of the New York Review of Books carries a very devastating review of your latest book, Courage to be Catholic, by Gary Wills, in which he attempts to demolish your arguments point by point.
It doesn't do anything of the sort, but...
He attempts, I said. He attempts. So the first part of my question is how you would reply to his attack. And secondly, would you give us your reflections on the form of Catholicism advocated by Dr. Wills and by James Carroll, which are currents in the Church which very demonstrably differ from your own? Thank you.
That's for sure. To tell you the truth, I am much more concerned as a matter of the health of the Catholic argument about Eamon Duffy's review or alleged review of my book in the current tablet than about Gary's thing. I mean, Gary, whom I've known for 35 years, we're both Baltimoreans. It's all in the American League East, you see. That's where all the action always is. He didn't really engage the argument at all. I mean, he went through his standard critique of the history of Humanae Vitae, the impact of Humanae Vitae. We know, I assume he repeated, perhaps from this very podium, his rather minimalist understanding of the role of the office of Peter in the Church, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, these are obvious points of disagreement. Both with Gary and with Eamon Duffy, who I think is a more serious student of the history of these matters, what most disturbs me, and it's not, well, we could throw in Scott Appleby in America and perhaps the editors of Commonweal while we're assembling my personal rogues gallery. What really bothered, I am used to personal nastiness. I mean, it's an unfortunate part of intellectual life and being a public figure. I don't like it, but, you know, the scar tissue has built up sufficiently that I don't fret about it. What really disturbs me about the response of the past several weeks in these various journals is the absolute failure to offer an alternative account of this crisis. I have at least put out a proposal. It's a complicated one. It's far more complicated than Professor Duffy acknowledges in the tablet. But I freely say in the book, this is one possible interpretation of this. If others have a comprehensive account of how this happened, when it did, and how it did, I would like to hear it. I think that is part of the responsibility of those who wish to say, no, George, you've got it wrong. Maybe I have. Perhaps I do. I don't think so. But I won't know, and no one else will know, unless an alternative account is offered. And that is a serious, it seems to me, defect of responsibility, and I think it has something to do with a profound disinclination to look at what I described this evening as this ecological problem. That this can be understood in many ways. This is one, I think, very illuminating way to look at it. Institutions have ecologies as well as ecosystems. And the absolute disinclination to say, what have these problems of the past 35 years done to the Catholic ecology, such that these problems manifested themselves with this intensity at this point in history, and the failure to respond to them took the patterns that it did. This deeply, deeply troubles me, because it suggests we're not having a real conversation about this. So I would like to urge Gary, Jim Carroll, Eamon Duffy, Scott Appleby, whomever, please give us an alternative account. Give us something that we can have a real conversation about, and please do not pretend that turning the Catholic Church into a kind of high liturgical Unitarianism constitutes an answer to that. That's not an alternative account. That's not alternative. Tell us why this happened, when it did, and how it did. Connect the dots. Make the effort to connect the dots. Yes.
As you described theological education in the seminary, you suggested that seminaries aren't really introducing the seminarians to figures like Augustine. And I was wondering what studies or data or evidence you have to support that claim.
Well, I didn't say they weren't introducing them to Augustine. I said that what I said specifically was, in an intellectual environment in which it is thought that modern thought is inherently superior to all other previous forms of thought, you're just not going to take seriously that which came before now. I think that is less of a problem today, frankly, than it was 20, 25, perhaps even 30 years ago. I think there has been a serious reform of much of seminary formation. During the years when Monsignor McCrae and I were hanging out together at the Pontifical North American College in Rome while I was preparing Witness to Hope, which I noticed charmingly is described on the flyers, whereas Professor Appleyard, as a biography of Pope John Paul II. That is my Advent humility lesson for the season. I watched an institution which had been deeply, deeply troubled in the mid-1980s, transformed through the leadership of men like Monsignor McCrae into what I regard as a model. And yet, and Monsignor and I have talked about this, I still came out of even that experience thinking that most seminarians do not learn to love theology, even today. I think it's the rare new ordinand today who thinks of theology as his intellectual discipline, which has a literature with which he must remain current, in the way that, you know, my brother the doctor or my daughter the medical student think about medicine, biology, biochemistry, etc., as this is part of my life until the end. And I have to stay in touch with this. And I think that's perhaps the next stage, that is certainly part of the next stage of seminary reform, is to figure out a way to get our priests to love the discipline that should be their intellectual nurturance for the balance of their ministry. And that certainly means giving man a sense of the theological enterprise. As George Florovsky, the Russian Orthodox theologian, has this wonderful phrase, the ecumenism of time. The ecumenism of time. Theology, at its best, is about the ecumenism of time. It's a multi-generational, trans-millennial conversation. And that, there's still too little of that in our seminaries. I think anybody who goes to one, senses this immediately. Yes, this gentleman up here has been eagerly trying to get at. You can yell. You're from Boston.
You've talked about the church. And it seems to me that your definition of the church is out of touch with Vatican II, that is the people of God. To you, the church is the position of the priest. So can you differentiate that? Because I don't think anybody would say that since the building has fallen down because the foundation was broken, that it's good to build another building. And unless we come to a concept of what is the church, and that really seems to be what our problem is.
I think I defined it in the paper. I said the church is a communion of disciples gathered by and accountable to an authoritative tradition. The church is not something we make up. The church is something given us by Christ. We don't make up the church. Christ gives us the church in its essential constitution of truths and a few basic institutions, sacraments, ministerial priesthood and episcopate, etc. We don't make that up. That is the gift of Christ to us, because no human institution, no institution that we make, could possibly do all the things that we claim the church does every day. Baptizes people into the Lord, forgives sins, celebrates the Eucharist of the body and blood of Christ. That can happen in the church which we compose, because the church, in the final analysis, is Christ's. It's not ours. I mean, Paul takes 16 chapters to try to explain this to the Romans, and it seems to me pretty foundational stuff. The council, if you look at the dogmatic constitution on the church of Vatican II, council fathers ransack the Old and New Testaments for dozens of images, agrarian images, architectural images, military images, political images, to try to describe the many facets of the church. They pay a great deal of attention in the Second Vatican Council to Pius XII's proposal that the church should consider itself primarily as the mystical body of Christ. They introduced this phrase, the church is the people of God. All of these images are in play all the time. You try to reach through all of that and get some essential thing, something that makes the church what it is that nothing else is. I think it is this notion of the church as a communion of disciples, disciples of Jesus Christ, who gives the church its essential foundation and constitution, who abides in the church through his Holy Spirit, and who gives us the church each day until he comes in glory. Maybe one more here, and then we're going to, is that how we doing on time, Joe? Okay. Yeah. David.
My name's David Hollenbach. I'm one of the theologians here at Boston College, and George Weigel is an old friend. So,
let's talk about Iraq, David. Let's talk about
you want? Let's do that later.
12 months of this stuff. I'm ready to get back to our old.
But I agree with a large amount of what you've said, and I think I agree in a very fundamental way with the point you're making about the causality of this having to do with an ecology question within the dynamics of the way the church as a whole is functioning as an interrelated system of beliefs and behaviors and symbols and holiness, and I really agree with that part very much. When it comes to the issue, though, of a culture of dissent, and where the ecology gets out of line, I think we have a disagreement, and a fundamental one. Especially if the culture of dissent, as you seem to imply, it has thrown off the ecology. If that's understood as being based upon humanae vitae and a series of other dimensions of the sexual ethic that follow from the claim that all sexual intercourse must be essentially open to procreation and therefore contraception is unacceptable. A number of other things flow from that, about the roles of men and women, about the way to assess the reality of homosexuality, and a whole series of other issues are connected with this procreative primacy. It seems to me that it's possible to create a foul-up in the ecology if the teaching on those issues itself is wrong. And the question then becomes, theologically, where's the problem coming from? Is it from those who say, no, contraception is not wrong, no, the role of women can change in such a way that women could exert new roles within the leadership of the church, no, there are certain aspects of persons who are constitutionally homosexual that demand a different kind of respect than they've been getting? If that's called if those no's are part of the culture of dissent, I would argue that's not what's screwing up the ecology. It's rather the positions against which those no's are being raised that is throwing off the ecology, and that those are the issues that need to be changed. I'm agreeing with you on a large part of what you've said, but it goes to the central issue about where is the dynamic problem originating and where is it not originating.
Well, obviously we're not going to sort this out in 2 minutes, so we will have to let me know next time you're in Washington. We will, as usual, buy the Scotch wholesale and go at it. I think this really is worth exploring. I think this is very much worth exploring because it is the central ecclesiological issue that I'm trying to get at here. I am trying, among other things, to take the Council's turn to history very seriously, and therefore the question of what in this history of the past, let's say, 35 years accounts for the problems that are now manifest is a very, very important one. It seems to me that one would want to begin theologically thinking about these problems through this concept of communion. And what does it mean to be in full communion with the Church? Now, the Catholic Church has, in fact, in its ecumenical thinking, a rather elastic view of what constitutes the una sancta, the one Church of Christ, which the Council says subsists in the Catholic Church but is not identical to the borders of the Catholic Church. Okay, so what does that mean? That means, well, all our Baptist friends are, in some sense, part of the one Church of Christ and therefore are in communion with us, but in a defective way. And that communion is deficient. It's not a full communion, and in fact, the whole ecumenical jargon now is how do we reestablish full ecclesial communion. My suggestion is that when it is said, as you, I think, courageously said, I mean, you're not pulling any punches here, the supreme teaching authority is manifestly teaching falsehoods in its own name, then that's a very, very serious ecclesiological problem, because I think traditionally, it has been understood that those who would say that have themselves fractured their communion with the center of the Church's unity, which is that teaching authority. So we're into very, very deep waters here. Now, let me say this just in terms of a substantive question. One of the things that has most struck me in an endless series of runnings around the campuses over the past 3 years, in the wake of Witness to Hope and now this business, is the degree to which on many, many campuses, where the Church's sexual ethic was once simply dismissed as idiocy of the first order, there is a great openness to looking at this through the prism of J.P. Tu's theology of the body. There is a recognition of the enormous damage done to human lives, primarily to the lives of the parents of today's students, by the libertinism of the sexual revolution. I think there's a whole new openness to the Church's proposal in these matters if it is framed in the deeply humanistic way that the Holy Father has framed it in the theology of the body, and I think it is a shame that discussion of that material tends to be limited to little enclaves intellectually around the Catholic world and does not seem to be present in other theological faculties to the degree to which in my judgment, it ought to be. So, no, I think this is one of the nubs of the ecclesiological problem, the ecclesiological dimension of this problem, and I thank you for identifying that, and we will have to have at it. Good. I think we're going to have to roll here. Thank you all very much for